Thanks, Rob, for that very generous introduction. I was interested to note that this is the 11th Korea TESOL convention. I went back through my records. I think I've been to about 9 of them, so it's a conference that I love coming to, and one that I make every effort to get to. At one stage it looked as though I wasn't going to get this one because I have many commitments this month.
I begged.
Rob begged, and so what I did, I had to give the plenary at the International Association of Teachers of Swedish as a Foreign Language a few days ago. So what I did, I flew to Sweden for the day, which was a form of insanity, I guess. Left Hong Kong at 1 o'clock in the morning on a Friday, got to Stockholm at about lunchtime on Friday. Actually had time to have a look around Stockholm, lovely city. Gave my plenary Saturday morning. I was back in Hong Kong for lunch on Sunday. Also did an internet class, stopping off at Heathrow Airport on the way. So again, I think as those of you who were in Dave Sperling's presentation immediately preceding this one, he made the point that with technology it has its advantages, but one of the definite cons is the fact that 24/7 you're on the job, or potentially on the job. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk about, look at the ELT curriculum and to look at how from my perspective, technology has actually added value to the things that we can do. I don't believe, certainly with the experiences that I've had over the last 6 or 7 years running the master's degree for Anaheim University, and also the involvement that I've had both at Hong Kong University and also working with a commercial organisation called Global English in San Francisco. I don't believe that at this stage technology is a replacement for classroom interaction, but I do believe that it can add value to what we do in a number of important ways, and it's some of those ways that I'd like to explore with you this afternoon. As I said at the beginning, while some of you were still coming in, some of the screenshots that I've taken from some of the websites are a little difficult to read, and so those of you at the back may not be able to read them. I will post this PowerPoint onto my website, so you can actually visit the website if you so desire, and you can take a closer look at some of the slides that may not have been particularly clear. And the URL for that is www.nunan.info, I-N-F-O. Okay. Let me make a few contextualizing remarks to start outlining my understanding of the concept of curriculum, because it's been variously defined. My definition is a fairly broad one. I'd like to suggest that there are at least 3 ways of looking at the curriculum. The curriculum as plan is probably the traditional way of looking at curriculum. This is all of the work that goes on before a particular course of study is enacted. Okay, and typically the curriculum as plan will consist of a syllabus which will lay out the content of the curriculum, methodology including teaching materials and so on, and also tools for assessment and evaluation. But taken together, these are what I call the curriculum as plan. And as I just said, for many people this is the be-all and the end-all. That is the curriculum. I've argued for many years, however, that in order to have a more comprehensive view of curriculum, we also need to look at the curriculum as action. And this is the curriculum as it unfolds in the moment-by-moment realities of classroom teaching. Now, the naive view of curriculum is that what gets planned is what gets taught. Okay, we go in and we're just like a kind of conduit, and from the laughter around the room, obviously, you all recognise that this is a naive notion. And that if I divided you all into 2 different groups, invited you to come to Hong Kong to visit my centre, gave half of you the curriculum documents, plans, teaching materials and so on that we use, and the other half invited you to come into my class and the classrooms of my colleagues, and then put you together in a kind of information gap way, you'd have very, very different perspectives on what the English Centre University of Hong Kong curriculum is like. And that's not the whole story. There's also the curriculum as outcome. And this is what the learners actually take away from the curriculum. Okay, this is what they actually learn, hopefully as a result of engagement in your classrooms of various kinds. And again, if I divided you not into 2 but into 3, got 1/3 to look at the curriculum documents and plans and materials, 1/3 to go into the classrooms, and 1/3 to collect data from learners, collect samples of their spoken and written language, and try to then reconstruct the curriculum from that language. Again, you'd have three very different views of curriculum. And they're not mutually exclusive, but I think in order to have a comprehensive understanding of teaching and learning in any situation whatsoever, I think we need to have we need to keep in mind these three different dimensions. Okay? One of the concepts that I have been promoting for many years now is that of learner-centeredness. Okay, the notion of getting learners, starting with where the learners are at, getting learners invested in their own learning processes and using information about learners and, where possible, from learners as the starting point for various aspects of curriculum design. And, of course, one of the assumptions that we certainly can't make, certainly in the situation where I teach, I cannot make the assumption that my learners are able to make informed decisions at the beginning of the learning process about what they want to learn, how they want to learn, and how they want to be assessed. And it's for this reason that if you go into my classroom at the beginning of the teaching year, for example, we're still fairly close to the new academic year at the moment, you'll see that what I'm doing looks very teacher-centred, because that's what my learners expect, having come out of the high school systems where, in the main, they've been subjected to very teacher-centred instruction. But gradually, through some of the techniques that I'm going to share this afternoon, I gradually begin to move them along this continuum from a fairly teacher-centred classroom through to a learner-centred classroom. But I only do that when I'm confident that they've actually begun to acquire some of the kinds of process skills, some of the reflective process skills that they need in order to make the kinds of informed judgments that are going to result in effective learning and teaching on the part of the learners. And one of the major rationales for adopting this approach is that I want to try and lead my learners towards becoming autonomous learners. Okay? Why do I want to do that? Because ultimately, if somebody is going to be a successful language user, then they have to be able to exercise a degree of autonomy. They're not going to be able to they're not going to have a teacher, unless they're extremely wealthy, I guess. They're not going to have a teacher or a resource person with them whenever they want to communicate. They're going to have to make those communicative decisions for themselves. And my colleague at the English Centre, Phil Benson, in his latest book on learner autonomy, has suggested that autonomy is a capacity. He says, because various kinds of abilities can be involved in control over learning. Researchers generally agree that the most important abilities are those that allow learners to plan their own learning activities, monitor their progress, and evaluate their outcomes. Although, as I've just said, relatively few learners, in my experience, are able to make these kinds of decisions or have the skills to be able to make these decisions at the beginning of the learning process. And so I have a kind of parallel track. I have my language content syllabus, but I also have my learning process syllabus. And I try to gradually lead my students through to a point where they're developing not just communicative language skills, but also learning process skills of various kinds. And I'm going to go through the 9-step program with you this afternoon and show you some of the ways in which I've put these ideas into my textbooks, but then how deploying technology has allowed me to do some of these things much more effectively. So step number 1 is to make the instructional goals clear to the learners. One of the things that surprises me in my teacher training work is how infrequently teachers actually spell out the pedagogical agenda for the learners. All too often the teacher knows what the plan is, but doesn't make that plan explicit to the learners in ways that make sense to them. And I think that this is extremely important. I think if the learners have some idea about where they're going, they'll have a better idea, they'll know where it is when they get there. Step number 2 then is to allow learners to start to create their own pedagogical goals. So having sensitized learners as the first step, sensitize learners to the instructional goals of a learning program. The next step is to then begin to allow learners to create their own goals, or give them choices. Say, here are 2 or 3 options to work on next week. Spend a little bit of time talking in groups and decide which of these options you would like to work on. Another interesting challenge, and again, the ability to do this in many situations is relatively constrained, is encouraging learners to activate their language outside of the classroom. Last year, one of my graduate students investigated this particular issue, and he got learners who said, well, we don't use language at all outside of the classroom. He got them to look for and to document opportunities that did exist. And so, in fact, simply by asking the question, it was a form of consciousness raising. And they eventually came up with over 65 different ways that it was possible to activate English outside of the classroom. The other interesting thing that he did was to say to his learners, I'm trying to learn Putonghua, Mandarin Chinese. Can you recommend to me ways in which I can get practice in Putonghua outside of my classroom as well? And again, he got some very interesting responses. The first 3 steps, I guess, focus more on content, although I think it's difficult to separate content from process in many ways that I won't go into this afternoon. But step number 4 is beginning to raise awareness on the part of learners of the learning process itself. One step on for that is then helping learners to identify their own preferred learning styles and learning strategies. And again, there are many different ways in which this can be done. And in a minute, I'm going to illustrate this point with a number of ideas. The next step is that of encouraging learners to make choices. And again, it could be argued that the good language user is the person who makes wise choices. You know, for example, and eminent linguists such as Michael Halliday have attempted to describe the English language as a system of choices. And so if you look, say, at any subsystem of the language, such as modal verbs, you can see that that they present the learners with potential sets of choices. And the good language communicator is the one who makes wise choices when it comes to language use. By extension, you could argue that the good language learner is the one who makes wise choices when it comes to language learning strategies and so on. But again, notice that as a prior step, in order to make those choices, they need to be aware of what choices are and options are available. Step number 7 is allowing learners to generate their own pedagogical tasks in various ways. Step number 8 is taking this one step further and actually encouraging learners to become teachers. And again, there are many different ways in which this can be done. And it can be done very simply. In a reading class, for example, where you have the standard kind of reading textbook that has usually some kind of a warm-up task, then a reading passage, and then a set of comprehension questions. Throw the comprehension questions away. Give the text to the learners, or give 2 different texts to learners in 2 different groups. Get them to read the text, get them to come up with their own questions, and then get them to exchange the reading texts with another group in the class. A fairly simple technique, relatively easy to activate, but illustrates this principle of encouraging learners to become teachers. And then the final step, encouraging learners to become researchers, encouraging learners to see that language isn't just out there to be poured into them, but it's an active, living entity, and they can get a great deal out of the process of discovering how language works for themselves through various kind of guided and inductive learning principles and approaches. And of course, for those of us, I've been trying to learn Cantonese for the last 10 years, undoubtedly the most difficult language I've ever tried to learn. And I've tried to do it through a self-directed procedure, so I don't have a regular teacher. And so, in a sense, that's what I'm doing. I'm interacting in the community, I'm picking up bits of the language, and in a sense, I'm acting as a researcher. although I have had some disasters where the results of my research have led me badly astray, but we won't go into those at this particular moment either. What I've done so far then is to try and spell out for you these 9 steps that I have implanted into my curriculum as a kind of set of parallel processes to the actual straight language content. Let me show you now, illustrate each of these in turn and show how they can be activated in the classroom, and then how technology has enabled me to augment what I do in more traditional ways. So, in terms of making instructional goals clear to the learners, in the traditional kind of pedagogical materials and activities at the beginning of a unit, it's a good idea to spell out the goals for the learners. So in this unit you'll ask others to do things. I'd like to support Greenpeace. I want you to take a few minutes to read this brochure. Make excuses. I'm sorry, but I seem to be out of cash right now. Talk about hypothetical situations in the past. If it had been me, I'd have changed jobs. Okay, so they're there on the page. Teacher presumably points these out to the learners, maybe even gets them to react or to evaluate them in some way. How competent are you at doing these particular kinds of language goals? In recent years, I've been experimenting with ways in which instructional goals can be presented to the learners through the web-based materials that I now use to supplement most of my classroom materials. So here is an example of where at the beginning of in this particular course that I've taken these aims and objectives from, which is an academic writing course, the aims themselves, the students have some classroom instruction, then they also have some web-based instruction, and some of the actual writing. So I don't think that spending a lot of time in class time in actually getting the students to do writing is particularly fruitful or useful. But here what happens is that every time the learners log on to this particular site to download their latest writing assignments, the aims and objectives pop up for the learner. So that's actually that pops up to them and reminds them of the overall aim of the course, and then the subordinate objectives that they're working towards. The next step, as you might remember, was to allow learners to create their own pedagogical goals. And here again, I have an online study plan that leads the learners through a number of steps that culminates in them creating their own language learning plan. So the first thing they do is to check their study plans. What kind of language learner are you? These different sections each has a questionnaire or some kind of interactive quiz that the learners work through, and that provides them with the results of which are then all fed in together into one overall coherent plan for the learner. So there's the first one is, what kind of language learner are you? What resources do you use to help you learn English? How long do you want to spend studying English each day? Which style of studying do you prefer? What's your English level? What are your learning objectives? What will you do to help yourself learning English? Okay, and so this is the kind of overall map or plan of this part of the site. Let's look at some examples. What resources do you use to help you learn English? There's a little gloss. Self-directed learning is a way of learning without direct control from the teacher. There are many resources that can help you to learn in this way. How many of the following resources have you used to help you learn English? And so they just click on the appropriate button, often, sometimes, never. An English dictionary, an English grammar book, video player, video camera, computer, and so on. Okay? How long do you want to spend studying English each day? This starts off with a little inventory that asks the learners. It says, so now it's time for you to do some goal setting. First, how long do you want to spend studying English each day? How much time do you have? Complete the table. And so activities such as sleeping, getting up, time spent at work or college, travel time, preparing and eating meals, short breaks, homework, physical exercise, watching TV, going out with friends and other. And if it comes to more than 24 hours, then the computer program, when they hit the submit button, the computer program reminds them that there's only 24 hours in the day and they need to go back and adjust their plan. In this particular example, when I did did a dummy run through this to capture some screenshots for this presentation, the total came to 23.5 hours, and so the program then says, this leaves you 0.5 hours for studying English each day. Is that more or less the time you expected? And so again, it reminds the students. The next sample here is getting students to do a self-evaluation of their own current English level. How do you rate your current level of English? From I know the vocabulary, expressions and grammar to talk about basic subjects in English, I can talk about past and the future, right down to I can participate fluently in English in most conversations and discussions on a variety of topics. So the students do a little self-assessment of where they're currently at. The next one says, well, okay, where would you like to get to? Okay, during this course period that you're studying, which level would you like to get to? And this person wants to go from one level, from participating in short social business conversations in English, using past and future to talk about everyday subjects, to have the communication strategies to discuss most subjects in English, know the vocabulary and expressions to use in most situations. The next one, what will you do to help yourself learn English? And again, gives them ideas for ways in which they can work on their English outside of the classroom. Recording a study group discussion and then listening and evaluating yourself. Keeping a learning diary in which you note down things like where, when, why, for how long and with whom you spoke English, and so on. So once they've gone through all of these little questionnaires and completed them, they hit the submit button, the program comes up with this overall study plan. And you can see that it gives the date and the time that the plan was created, because they can go back and they can modify their plan and then it will update it. So the number of hours per day I will spend studying: 1, preferred style of studying, working on my own with regular advice about materials and study techniques from a teacher consultant. Desired English level, to have the communication strategies to discuss most subjects in English, know the vocab and expressions to use in most situations. Learning objectives are grammar and vocabulary, and then preferred ways of learning. So what it does is it pulls together and provides on a single page the different aspects that the learners have been working through. The next step was to encourage learners to use their second language outside of the classroom. And again, in textbooks, again, apologies that I've taken these screenshots from my own textbooks, but I happen to have them on the computer, and so it was easier than going and finding others. But in one of my textbooks, at the beginning and at the end of each level, the learners are invited to think about things such as how they like to learn, and in this case, out of class, how do you like to learn out of class? Talking with native speakers, watching English TV movies, reading English newspapers, and so on. Through the computer, however, you can actually do this in a much more powerful and interactive way. And again, I've placed onto my website an inventory that I took from some work that I did back in the 1980s in Australia with Ken Willing, Ken Willing's Learning Styles and Strategies, which enables the learners to... The questionnaire itself enables you to assess the learner's overall preferred learning style: communicative, authority-oriented, concrete learners, and so on. The problem with that is that you've got lots of... Actually, I'll just... Here it is here, yeah. As a preliminary, the students identify their faculty year of study, the results they got on the examination they have to do at the end of high school called the use of English, how many hours a week they use English off campus, and so on. They then complete the Willing inventory, and there are 30 items on this inventory, and it includes things such as: in English class I like to learn by reading, in class I like to learn by using cassettes, in class I like to learn by games, and so on. And about half a dozen of these options are the preferred options. They've been randomised, are the preferred options for the communicative learners, others for the authority-oriented learners, and so on. The tedious thing about the questionnaire is that you then have to go through and you have to add up all of the different combinations to give the best overall score to identify the learner's general preferred learning styles. The nice thing about this computer program is that when the students have made their choices and hit submit, the program itself automatically then analyses the responses and then tells the learner and the teacher what their overall preferred learning styles is. The other thing that it does is it captures all of this data and archives it. So I now have about 1,000 data from about 1,000 learners sitting on my computer. And as soon as I get time, I'm going to analyse that and to look at, say, some of the correlations between the learning preferences that the learners have expressed and other things such as the kinds of faculty they're studying in, how actively they're learning English outside of class, what their language proficiency level was as measured by a standardised proficiency test, and so on. Next step was encouraging learner choice, and again in a traditional textbook you'd have something like this. You choose, do A or B, and there are two different options. Often one will be aimed at learners with, say, field independent, and the other with learners with a field dependent cognitive style. But again, it doesn't really matter which choice the learner makes. The main thing is the hidden message here that language learning is a matter of making choices. Within the computerized part of my own learning program, I have a thing called a self-directed English program in which the learners make choices from a number of options that are available through the computer, and it's really a kind of an extension from the learning plan that I've already shown you. But it gives them a choice as to which aspect of the language they want to work on, and it can be a skills-based thing. It could be improving my academic listening, or it could be improving my pronunciation, or whatever. And then again, the learners are taken through a series of options and choices that results in them completing a learning contract where they contract with themselves and with the teachers to complete a certain project with a set of pedagogical goals, resources, and so on. The next step was allowing learners to generate their own tasks. Again, an example from some of my own materials where at the end of a unit of work, the learners are invited to get onto the web and to carry out a task that relates to the work they've been doing. In this particular unit, they were doing work on further study. So in this web surfing challenge, they have to find a degree program in a subject that they're interested in a place they might like to study. Try using the subject and degree programs as keywords. Type the name of the school where it's located, and the degree is available in the box below. And they then put in their name, their email address, the email address of their teacher. And when they've completed the task itself and a report on the task is generated for them and also for their teacher. Encouraging learners to become teachers. I've taken this idea from one of my former grad students, Wendy Asinda, who developed the project where she got learners to go out and with video cameras to find groups of native speakers and to interview the native speakers, and to then use that interview data to create a little learning package. And the learners then they worked in groups, they'd exchange their package with the learners from another group, and the learners from the other group would work through the package. And she summarises her work. This was published in the ELT journal some years ago, where she says that I believe that the goal of teaching each other was a factor of paramount importance. Being asked to present something to another group gave a clear reason for the work, called for greater responsibility to one's own group, and led to increased motivation and greatly improved accuracy. Being an expert on a topic noticeably increased self-esteem. And I'm sure that those of you who have had the experience will validate this notion that if you're confronted with having to teach a subject that you're not fully in control of, it's a great stimulus to mastery. I remember when I first had to take a class in teaching inferential statistics, and I hadn't done any stats for years, and I was panic-stricken, but it sure got me motivated to brush up on my knowledge of statistics. And then the final step was encouraging learners to become researchers. And I've taken some work from elsewhere. This is from Shirley Bryce Heath's study that was published in a book I edited in 1992 called Collaborative Language Learning and Teaching. And what Heath did was an indirect way of stimulating students to start to explore language in context. She wrote to a group of students who were being taught by one of her grad students and asked them to keep a record or a diary of the opportunities that they had for using English outside of the classroom. And to begin with, they said, and she said she wanted samples of those language. To begin with, they said, well, we never come across any English whatsoever. And this is in the United States, so probably not surprising. This was but again, you know, simply asking the question changed the learners' mindsets, and they did start to identify and document samples of language which they kept in their diaries. And she says that students are asked to work together as a community of ethnographers, collecting, interpreting and building a databank of information about language in their worlds. They had access to knowledge that I wanted, and the only way I could get that knowledge was for them to write to me. They collected field notes, wrote interpretations of patterns they discovered as they discussed their field notes, and they answered the questions I raised about their data collection and their interpretations. And again, this wasn't something that came instantly. It happened over the course of a year, but by the end of the academic year, not only had they become quite adept at this kind of ethnography, as she says, but they also significantly increased their grades. These were all minority kids who were in grave danger of failing out of the system, and a number of them even managed to get A grades on their English classes at the end of the year. So let me just try and pull this together from a slightly theoretical perspective. And I'm going to suggest that, again, I'm trying to suggest that this is not an all or nothing process, that it's a gradual process, that some learners will make tremendous strides when it comes to becoming more autonomous. Some will only move a little way along the autonomy continuum. But this little schema relates to what I've called the language content domain. And step number one is simply awareness, where learners are made aware of the pedagogical goals and content of their program. The next step is what I've called active involvement, where learners are involved in selecting their own goals and objectives from a range of alternatives on offer. Step number three is intervention, where learners are involved in modifying and adapting the goals and content of the learning programs. I had to come up with some kind of fancy labels towards the end. Apologies. Creation. Learners create their own goals and objectives. And then transcendence, where they go beyond the classroom and make links between the content of the classroom with the world beyond the classroom. Okay? And this would be the ultimate step that I would hope to get my learners to eventually. So that's relating to the language content domain, and we can propose a similar scheme in relation to the learning process domain. So first of all, we have awareness, where learners identify the strategy implications of pedagogical tasks and identify their own preferred ways of learning, their own preferred styles and strategies. The next step is active involvement, where learners make choices among a range of options. Step number three, intervention, where learners modify or adapt learning tasks that you provide for them or that exist in textbooks and so on. One of the interesting things that I find as a textbook author when I go around and visit schools in Korea, Japan, wherever, and one of the most common criticisms is, well, there's too much stuff in your books, we can't get through it all. And my response is, well, you're not actually meant to. It's meant to be a resource to draw on. And very often the teachers say, well, but the students have to buy the books. If they don't use every task, they feel as though they're being cheated. And that's a real perception. But unfortunately, it's this view of a textbook not as a set of resources to be drawn on actively and creatively in the learning process, but as a kind of a roadmap to be followed almost religiously. The fourth step, creation. Learners create their own pedagogical tasks. And then finally, transcendence, where learners become teachers and researchers. What I've tried to do this afternoon is to illustrate the 9 steps and some of the other principles in relation to both the traditional kinds of materials that we're very familiar with, but I've also tried to show ways in which the the use of technology can actually make our job in this regard much more effective. As I said at the beginning, I don't see technology as a replacement for the classroom. I see it as a way of helping us to do what we do more effectively. First of all, I've tried to show you how using IT can facilitate the creation of individualized learning plans. And I have two ways of doing this, as I illustrated. The one where the learners work through a set of questionnaires, which then generates a study plan, and the self-directed learning program, where the learners again work through a process that culminates in a learning contract, where they contract with me to achieve a particular learning objective. And so if I've got 25 different students in my class, each of them there'll be 25 different learning plans. I used to do this before I deployed technology, but the use of technology makes it that much more effective. It also takes the burden off me considerably. Learners can learn at their own pace and at their own time. It's also amenable to a range of styles, strategies, and learning modalities. Again, I tried to touch on ways in which these were realised through some of the IT resources that I've been working on in my own situation. The other thing about technology, and I think this is particularly useful for if we're working with beginners or post-beginners, is that technology is a very patient tutor, okay? The computer doesn't get red in the face and shout or grind its teeth, when the learner continually doesn't get the drill right. And so the learners can spend as much time as they like, again, working in a secure environment, because they're the only ones interacting with the materials, working in an environment where they can practice as much as they like in order to achieve fluency. It also, I think, is beginning to redefine the notion of the classroom. The traditional idea of the classroom is it's a place similar to this, although usually much smaller, that has 4 walls, a ceiling, a floor, chairs, desks, whiteboard, and so on, and various other resources. But if we think of learning as taking place in virtual spaces, well, actually, learning takes place up here, doesn't it? Okay, that's where it takes place, and so wherever this goes, that's where the learning is going. But if learners are increasingly involved in working on their English and improving their English through various forms of technology, web-based learning and other kinds of learning, then I think we need to begin to redefine our notion of the classroom. And a lot of the interactive and collaborative projects that I'm involved in, and I'm sure that some of you are involved in, also help us to redefine the notion of the classroom. We have an exchange scheme with a couple of Japanese universities, and what we do is we start the teaching about a month before they actually come to Hong Kong over the summer, and it's all web-based. But again, they are paired up with a student at Hong Kong U, and they work collaboratively in this virtual classroom space for about 4 weeks before they actually come to Hong Kong. And one of the exciting things there is that as soon as they actually see each other face to face, it's amazing how quickly they bond together. So I've deliberately tried to get through this in time to allow for some questions, and I've done so. So I will pause now and invite questions from the floor. And what I'll do is to repeat the question for the camera so that the webcast folks can. I'm glad you're not doing to me what happened to me a few years ago when Jack Richards and I at a TESOL convention did back in Long Beach, 95. We did the very first webcast, and they had little mics in our ears, and so there were people in Saudi Arabia and Ecuador and places asking questions, and the link wasn't very good, and so we couldn't really hear. And so every time we got a question we couldn't hear, Jack would say, "I think that's one for you, David." So, questions from the floor? Yes?
You have a lot of web pages developed for your learners to use, like forms they can fill out, but we don't. Are there similar ones available somewhere?
There are, yes, and I can let you. I can post again. I'll post that information onto my website. And I'll put some of the links up there that you can follow. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Again, some of it's given that if you were in Dave Sperling said that he wasn't particularly technically apt. I can't remember the exact expression, but it was a great relief to me because I'm even less apt. But it's becoming increasingly encouraging for those of us who feel as though just when we're driving a car, we don't feel as though we need to be able to take the carburettor apart and put it back together again. We don't actually need to look under the bonnet or the hood of the computers these days in order to be able to begin to draw on lots of increasing numbers of resources that are out there. And there is a lot of stuff out there. It's simply a matter of knowing where to look. Yes?
Have you done any studies that attempt to determine the relationship between this approach and language acquisition?
The question is, have I done any studies to attempt to identify a link between let me see if I've got it right, the deployment, the adding of the IT dimension and language acquisition? The answer is no, although I've started to do so. I'm looking at, one of the things that I'm interested in is the potential for different forms of synchronous interaction, both voice chat and text chat. I've got a project with one of my grad students where we've got three sections of one of our undergraduate programs, and for tutorials, one group is working face-to-face, one group is working through a chat program, and the other group is working through a voice chat, text chat, voice chat, face-to-face. And we're recording each of the tutorials, and we're looking at aspects of the discourse. And one of the things that I'm interested in is this issue of uptake. So if one learner teaches another learner something, say a new vocabulary item or even a new structure, how do you say X or Y in English, does it subsequently appear in the discourse later on? The other interesting thing, of course, is that the text chat is a new kind of language, and that's another interesting thing to look at. I suspect that perhaps there mightn't be certain advantages to text chat, because in terms of language processing, I think it takes the pressure off the learners. Rather than having immediately to respond orally, they've got the luxury of time that's involved in actually typing. And so again, it would be interesting to see, and that's one of the things we're looking at, to see what sort of opportunities for acquisition actually occur as learners use these different media for communication. Rob?
In Korea, as more and more students are using IT for education or for personal purposes, we're seeing IT-type language creeping into their spoken language.
Right.
And there's the added factor of the Korean communication has their own set of emoticons that they're pulling into the English text communications.
Right.
With Japanese students and Hong Kong students interfacing, what kind of dynamics do you see there? Are they finding a middle ground? Are they adopting each other's stuff?
They're finding a middle ground, yeah. Well, they have, yes, by virtue of the fact that they're speaking different L1s, they're having to do that.
But they're not adopting a standard English. Instead, they're finding their own common interlanguage. Yeah. And again, there's been a lot of criticism, particularly with I saw some job applications recently that were published in a newspaper in Seattle, and it was showing the influence of text chat on high school kids' English, and showing how, while it's fine for the emergence, I mean, we're not going to be able to stop it anyway, while it's fine to have the emergence of different language that will inevitably reflect the different modes of communication, we also need to show learners that there are different forms of appropriacy, and there are different styles and registers of language that are appropriate for different situations and different contexts. Yes.
Are the classes that you teach for credit? And if so, then how does it relate that they set their own goals and their own pace, their own time? Good.
The question is, are the courses for credit? And if so, how is it possible for the learners to set their own pace and so on? Again, I think and this reflects that the last point in terms of redefining the notion of the classroom. It isn't possible to do this with every single class, but there are some classes that are sufficiently general and open-ended that it is possible. And even in a class such as an academic writing, yes, they are for credit. They're all for credit. All students at Hong Kong U have to do 2 3-credit courses in English through my centre as part of their degree program. But one of the other interesting things is if you focus on learning outcomes, because again, there's controversy even within my centre between my teachers, some of whom say, well, we've got to give them 3 hours a week in the classroom, otherwise we're cheating them. And my answer is, well, if they're learning productively, they could be sitting cross-legged on a mountaintop in Tibet for all I care, I mean, what I'm interested in is the end result. Are they able to do the things that are explicitly spelled out in performance terms? But again, it's not the be-all and end-all. It's not the total package. Usually when they're identifying a goal, it's some subsidiary part of their overall program. And in the one that I took the example from, 1/3 of the students' credit comes from the self-directed learning program and the contract that they develop and work on independently. Yes, the controversy is, okay, so your students, you're only having to teach 2 hours a week rather than 3. You're cheating. But again, it redefines the notion of the teacher, because I spend huge amounts of time setting this up, working with some of my technical people to put the stuff on the web, and then monitoring and evaluating the stuff that the students are putting up there. So it's not that I'm doing less teaching, I'm doing more, but it's redefining what I do. Yeah.
I've been desperately trying to develop my own educational sites. And what Rob brought up an issue that I've been dealing with, it sort of combines with the stuff you're talking about from Seattle. How do you feel about controlling the way that web language is being used? Because there's a lot of, I'm constantly torn between going, okay, we're trying to write in a certain way, but I don't want to infringe upon their ability to use the language in their own way.
Yeah, it's well, we are supposed to be language teachers. I guess it's the same kind of dilemma you have in a classroom, where you might be doing a fluency-focused activity and the learners are making mistakes, but you don't want to stop them because maybe they're into the activity. So what you do is to make a note of the language they're using and then use that for a follow-up session. A more worrying issue for me with text chat lessons that I've taught is where the learners seem to be less inhibited, probably because of the distance created by the technology, but not infrequently you'll find somebody using sexist or language that is inappropriate, or topics that are inappropriate, or addressing fellow students in a way that's inappropriate. And that's something that actually that I find more problematic than the actual did they get the subject verb object order correct. Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Sorry?
How do you deal with that problem?
Well, I usually talk to the, as you know, with most text chat programs, you can send a private message to an individual. I just, after about the second lesson, you know who the troublemakers are, and you get ready to jump on them. You can also kick them out of the classroom. Of course, you can withdraw their speaking rights. And normally, I send a private message if it's a really problematic person. I send them a private message and say, look, next time that happens, I'll kick you out for 20 minutes, and that usually works. I think we've got time for one more question.
Thank you. I'd like to just take up this issue of preferred learning styles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, helping the learners identify their preferred learning styles. But what strikes me is that then I'm just worried that they get entrenched in learning styles that aren't very effective to learning thereby. So where does this allow for us as teachers to try and modify their learning styles and direct them into learning styles which might be more effective?
Good question.
To pursue goals that they have set themselves.
Yeah, and this is a real dilemma for someone who espouses principles of learner-centeredness, because the learner-centered philosophy says you go with what the learners want. But what if what they want is totally ineffective or largely ineffective? It's the similar analogy. If you go along to a doctor, or a person presents themselves at a doctor, and he says, well, you've got the following condition, but I've got these blue pills here that'll fix you. And the learner says, no, but I want the pink ones. It would be professionally irresponsible for the doctor to say, oh, okay, well, here, have the pink ones. And I think it's a similar issue for us. And again, the whole reason for my adding this reflective dimension is that that's the only solution that I've come to, is getting the learners to be more reflective and getting the learners to the point where they can see, these strategies I'm using are not that effective. I have what I call the week 6 syndrome. In week 6, there's a knock on my door usually, knock, knock, knock. I open the door to my office. Yes. It's usually a delegation of about 6 of my students, and one of them will be the spokesperson and will say, we want to talk to you and about our English. And I say, well, that's why I'm here. What do you want to talk about? And they say, well, these classes, the things you're doing in class, they're not like we used to have. And I say, well, how long have you been learning English? And they'll often say something like 15 years. And I'll say, how's your English? And they'll say, terrible. And I say, well, isn't that a good enough reason to try something different? But yes, ultimately it's a matter of getting encouraging the learners, or even forcing the learners to try a range of different ways of going about learning, but then adding the reflective element, getting them to think about it and think about why you're doing things in a different way. I think we're getting the wind-up signal here, so I'd like to thank you all for your attention this afternoon and wish you luck.